We all know the image. Ruthless Norse warriors, storming the shores with axes raised, striking fear into medieval Europe. But what if Viking supremacy, as we know it, is missing a crucial chapter? What if the reason Vikings eventually turned west to raid Britain and France wasn't just opportunity, but necessity? Because heading south meant entering waters already claimed by an enemy who had turned the Baltic Sea into their personal hunting ground. And among them, one group stood out, a force that made even hardened Norse raiders hesitate before approaching their shores. The Wends, a confederation of Slavic tribes who ruled the southern Baltic coast and held something the Vikings desperately wanted but could rarely seize by force: control over the region's richest trade routes. While history remembers the Vikings as unstoppable sea wolves, the Wends were the ones who taught them that even wolves can drown. The name Wends itself comes from Germanic languages, essentially meaning the wanderers, or the ones who move by water. But this wasn't some primitive boat paddling culture. We're talking about the Obotrites, Velati, Rugians, Pomeranians, and Wagrians, tribes that collectively controlled over 400 miles or 650 kilometers of Baltic coastline from modern-day eastern Germany through Poland. They commanded the Oder and Vistula river systems, controlled access to the amber trade routes, and had something Vikings could only dream of: permanent naval bases. While Norse vessels were optimized for raiding, fast, light, and designed to beach anywhere, Wendish ships were built for something entirely different. They were constructing what naval historians now recognize as some of the first true warships in northern European waters. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ralsvik on Rügen Island shows vessels up to 100 feet or 30 meters long, with reinforced hulls designed specifically for ramming enemy ships. Think Roman trireme meets Viking longship, with a healthy dose of Slavic engineering innovation. The Rugians, in particular, had turned the island of Rügen into what can only be described as a medieval naval fortress. Multiple harbours, shipyards capable of building vessels larger than anything the Vikings possessed, and, this is where it gets really impressive, a signal fire network that could communicate enemy movements across the entire Baltic in a matter of hours. The Vikings had mobility, the Wends had infrastructure, and they used it brilliantly. Consider the strategic choke points these tribes controlled. The Obotrites dominated the approaches to modern-day Lübeck Bay. The Pomeranians controlled the mouth of the Oder River. The Wagrians held the critical passages around what's now Kiel Bay. Any Viking force trying to access the lucrative trade routes connecting the Baltic to Central Europe had to run a gauntlet of Wendish-controlled waters. The numbers tell the story. While a typical Viking raiding fleet might consist of 3 to 5 longships carrying 150 to 250 warriors, Wendish naval forces regularly fielded coordinated fleets of 20 to 30 vessels. When the Danish king Canute attempted to assert control over Wendish territories in 1043, he faced a coordinated naval response of over 600 ships. 600. That's not a raiding party, that's a maritime army. But raw numbers only tell part of the story. The Wends had developed something that would become standard naval doctrine centuries later: the concept of layered maritime defense. Their coastal settlements weren't just trading posts, they were fortified naval bases with multiple defensive rings, underwater obstacles to prevent enemy landings, signal towers for early warning, and most importantly, the ability to coordinate responses across hundreds of miles of coastline. But what truly unnerved Viking captains was this: the Wends didn't just defend their territory, they actively hunted in open waters. While Vikings targeted defenseless monasteries and trading posts, Wendish war fleets specifically sought out and engaged enemy naval forces. They had turned piracy into anti-piracy, and they were disturbingly good at it. The archaeological record from shipwrecks in the Baltic tells a sobering story. Dozens of Viking-era vessels show evidence of ramming damage. the distinctive crushed bow sections that indicate they were struck by purpose-built warships rather than damaged in storms or accidents. These aren't the remains of raids gone wrong. They're evidence of a systematic naval campaign designed to make the southern Baltic too dangerous for Viking operations. And it worked. By the 10th century, Viking expansion had largely shifted westward. It wasn't because the west was easier, it was because the southern Baltic had become too deadly. The Wends had achieved something extraordinary. They made the most feared raiders in Europe avoid their waters entirely. But when raiding failed, the Vikings tried something else. They came to conquer, and that's when things got even more intense. In 955 CE, a coalition of Danish and Norwegian raiders sailed 18 longships toward Rügen, expecting a typical tribute raid. Instead, they sailed into a coordinated ambush. The Rügian Wends, alerted by their signal fire network, assembled 35 purpose-built warships with reinforced bronze-fitted prows. The Wendish ships didn't grapple, they rammed. 14 Viking longships were sunk or captured in under 2 hours. Fewer than 200 of the 900 Vikings returned. The Danes later referred to it only as the great misfortune at the Island of Demons. This was no lucky win. The Wends had developed fleet tactics centuries ahead of their time. Designated ship roles, real-time coordination via horn and flag signals, and a strategic grasp of naval formations Vikings lacked. Viking fleets, built for speed and autonomy, struggled to respond. Instead of adapting, Viking leaders largely avoided Wendish waters. Raiding became economically unsustainable. Even a successful attack often meant devastating losses. So they shifted focus west, to Anglo-Saxon monasteries and Irish coasts. But the Wends weren't content with defense. By the late 10th century, they were launching their own raids. The 991 CE attack on Hedeby, a critical Viking trade hub, proved how far things had turned. A 22-ship Wendish fleet struck at dawn, burned harbour facilities, destroyed merchant vessels, and vanished before a response could form. Hedeby was considered impregnable until that day. The Wends had an edge: intelligence. Unlike the opportunistic Viking model, Wendish raids were planned with precision, informed by extensive trade networks that doubled as spy channels. One final campaign highlights their strategic brilliance. In 1018, Snut the Great launched a 200-ship assault. The Wends retreated inland, let the Danes overextend, then hit isolated garrisons through ambushes. By spring, Snut had gained no ground and lost a third of his force. When Vikings finally abandoned ships and took the fight to land, they thought they'd bypass the problem. They were wrong, because the Wends had spent just as much time mastering fortresses as they had the sea. A typical Viking land assault in the 10th century began with 300 to 500 warriors beaching their longships. They quickly formed a shield wall and advanced toward their target with precision. Most settlements, even fortified ones, would fall within hours. The combination of psychological terror, superior weapons, and coordinated tactics was simply overwhelming for most defensive forces. Now imagine those same battle-hardened Vikings approaching a Wendish settlement and stopping dead in their tracks, staring up at defensive works that seemed to defy everything they knew about medieval fortification. Because the Wends had spent centuries turning the science of castle building into an art form that would make modern military engineers nod in professional appreciation. Take the Obertreit stronghold at Oldenburg. When Danish forces encountered it in 983 CE, they faced concentric defensive rings nearly half a mile out from the centre. These weren't just ditches and stakes. Excavations show hidden pits, weakened ground, and sharpened stakes, meant to break enemy ranks before they even saw a wall. And those walls, not the standard vertical palisades. The Wends used interlocked horizontal timbers, distributing shock across the structure. Battering rams were all but useless. Gateways and corners, the usual weak points, were replaced with offset entries and interlocking firing angles that turned them into kill zones. Add to that elevated central keeps on man-made mounds, giving Wendish defenders clear lines of fire over every barrier. The psychological toll was immense. Vikings were used to seeing what they were attacking. Wendish forts revealed nothing but the next wall. When Danish Prince Magnus assaulted the Rugian fortress at Bergen in 1043, his army spent 3 days fighting through outer defences, only to discover they hadn't even reached the heart of the settlement. A third of his army deserted before dawn. But it wasn't just about defence. The Wends built for counterattack. Hidden sally ports allowed for night raids. Tunnels let defenders emerge behind enemy lines. Elevated platforms launched coordinated barrages. One striking example, at Wallin in 1066, Swedish besiegers believed they had the fortress surrounded, only for Wendish forces to erupt from underground, torch their siege works, and vanish again. The siege collapsed overnight. Many fortresses included sea access, allowing reinforcements and supplies even under siege. The fortress at Arkona, perched atop 150-foot chalk cliffs, could only be reached by sea, past defensive towers and underwater obstacles. By the early 11th century, Viking commanders had learned the hard way. Wendish fortresses weren't just hard to take, they were nearly impossible. And yet, even as Vikings retreated, other enemies were closing in. Enemies with more patience and far more resources. Here's what the sagas don't tell you about Viking victories against the Wends. They came at staggering cost. Take the 1018 capture of Ratzeburg. Celebrated in Norse chronicles, it required 8 months, 2,400 warriors, and 32 ships. The defenders, fewer than 800. Viking losses, nearly 60%. Afterward, Danish leadership quietly required royal approval for any operation in Wendish territory. It wasn't just caution, it was economic survival. A typical Viking raid on Anglo-Saxon land might yield massive returns with 10 to 15% casualties. Wendish campaigns often ended in 40 to 50% losses, and the settlements, well prepared, yielded little plunder. The psychological impact was just as bad. Vikings thrived on their identity as apex predators, but the Wends had flipped that script. Suddenly, the wolves weren't hunting, they were being hunted. By 1050, Viking expansion had pivoted west. Britain, Ireland, even North America. Not because they ran out of ambition, because the Baltic had become a death trap. Wendish resistance had a ripple effect. Their naval chokehold pushed Norse forces into new territories. Their intelligence networks quietly manipulated power dynamics across Scandinavia. They gathered intel through trade channels and used it to plan devastatingly precise counter-raids. In 1034, King Magnus of Denmark assembled 47 ships in total secrecy to assault Arkona. The Wends were waiting, ambush preset, tactics known, positions anticipated. Only 12 ships returned. Magnus didn't. The source of the intelligence leak? Never identified. But it showed the Wends weren't just resisting, they were infiltrating. By the mid-11th century, Wendish networks had grown so effective that Viking raids became blind stabs against a foe who always seemed a step ahead. Surprise, the Vikings' greatest weapon was gone. And worse, other Baltic communities were learning. Wendish-style fortifications, coordinated defences, and trade-based intelligence began spreading. The Viking Age wasn't just fading, it was being dismantled, piece by piece. But if the Wends thought their dominance would go unchallenged, they were about to face something no ambush or fortress could stop. A holy war with no exit plan. If there's one thing more dangerous than being weak in medieval Europe, it's being too successful while remaining pagan. The Wends were about to learn that the hard way. By 1140 CE, Wendish control of Baltic trade and their unmatched military innovations had become a strategic concern for Christian kingdoms. The response? The Wendish Crusade of 1147, a campaign not of conquest, but cultural annihilation, backed by the Pope and a coalition of German, Danish, and Polish forces. This wasn't a raid. Over 100,000 crusaders, 500 ships, and siege weapons descended on Wendish territory. Leaders like Henry the Lion and King Svein III of Denmark came not to pillage, but to erase. Wendish resistance followed a familiar pattern: inland retreats, naval raids on supply lines, and fortified strongholds ready for siege. But this time, it wasn't enough. Crusaders had studied the Viking failures. They brought engineers to collapse tunnels, built overwhelming siege lines, and cut off intelligence networks that had once made the Wends unbeatable. The fall of Dobin after 6 months was a turning point, not through assault, but starvation. Surrender meant conversion, integration, and the systematic dismantling of Wendish autonomy. This wasn't just military defeat, it was full-spectrum cultural replacement. Captured towns were rebuilt with Christian institutions, German laws, and imported settlers. Tribal identities were erased, and pagan temples replaced with churches. Even coordinated tribal defense couldn't stop it. The final blow came in 1164 at the Battle of Virchen. Prince Niklot's coalition of 15,000 warriors was crushed in under 4 hours. Niklot fell in a last charge, and with him, Wendish independence. But their legacy didn't vanish. The Crusaders adopted Wendish fortification methods. German castles borrowed their timber layering and elevation defense. Danish fleets applied Wendish naval tactics. Their final fortress, Arkona, fell in 1168. Not from failure of design, but from unrelenting resources applied over 2 years. The Wends were gone, but the kingdoms that destroyed them built their own power using Wendish innovations. They had defied the Vikings, rewired Baltic warfare, and reshaped the map of medieval Europe. And yet, within a generation, all that remained of them was legend, borrowed tactics, and fading stone markers on the edge of the sea. However, they weren't the only tribe the Vikings learned to fear, or failed to break. Across the Baltic, another name stirred dread in Norse hearts: fierce raiders who turned Viking tactics against them and vanished into myth when the wars ended. Click here to uncover the story of another forgotten tribe the Vikings couldn't conquer.